Okay, I'd like to just hand over to Vice President David Hirsch at this point to say a few words and perhaps set the tone for what we are doing today.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Now, this meeting is more than just the regular Rotary meeting. This is also a meeting that's organized by the Peacebuilding group, of which I'm currently the chair. So I'm very pleased to be able to have a peacebuilding focus for today. And I just want to give you a bit of an overview about how this is going to pan out. I wanted to say a few words first about peacebuilding in this club, because there's been a few things going on. Then we're going to hear some more music, have lunch, and then I will do a more formal introduction of our guest speaker, Brendon O'Connor. Just this past weekend, we had a positive peace workshop organized by Rotary Club of Sydney, and it was facilitated by Charlie Allen, Glenn, myself, and Kayla Cruz. And we had members of the Filipino community who were well represented. We had some of our recent Ukrainian members there. There were members from other Rotary clubs as well. And we were presenting a workshop based on the Institute for Economic and Peace Principles of Positive Peace. This is a workshop that is being delivered around the world now. And the objective is to teach more people about how to design peace-building projects that are consistent with the principles of positive peace. The other thing I wanted to mention to you was that there has been a recent Harvard University study into peace-building, what works, what doesn't. And they made the point that one of the most effective ways of peace-building around the world is something that they call health diplomacy. In other words, peace-building projects that focus on building health capital around the world. And the Australian government has picked up on the utility of this because they have just made a $4 million grant, that's the Albanese government has, to set up a rehabilitation hospital in Hebron, in the West Bank. Now, that was an initiative of something called Project Rosanna, which you may have heard about. Project Rosanna was started in Melbourne. Its founder, Ron Finkel, has spoken to this group. And Project Rosanna is supported by the Rotary Club of Sydney and other Rotary clubs in Australia and indeed around the world. Rosanna has so far developed partnerships with 14 hospitals across Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank, and has trained over 500 trauma physicians, psychologists, and nurses on both sides, so Israeli and Palestinians. Now, many Rosanna projects have now been canceled, courtesy of the US aid cuts. We were looking into whether we as a Rotary Club could help fund some of these canceled projects, and it turns out that we can't do that. But we can support initiatives that aren't affected by the US aid cuts, and there is a new initiative that is started by Rosanna that involves training female ambulance drivers in Israel and Palestine. It's a fairly modest project, but I'm looking into partnering with some other Rotary clubs to see whether we can collect some funds to help promote that health diplomacy program through Project Rosanna. The other thing that we're looking at, again, together with other Rotary clubs, is to work together with World Vision on at least one of their charitable projects that has been affected by the US aid cuts. So these are things that are in the works together at the moment that we are working with other clubs for. So I'm very pleased about that. Look, I just wanted, while you're settling in, to just take a few minutes to give you a bit of a reminder of what's been happening over the last month or so. Just to cast your mind back, seems like years ago now, but these are the kinds of things that have happened to the world that we live in. As you may remember, there was the blanket pardon of all of the January 6th rioters. The new Department of Justice is going to pursue the law enforcement officials who prosecuted the rioters, and they're going to try to prosecute those who prosecuted Trump. We know that Trump tore up the trade treaty that he himself negotiated with the United States and with Canada and Mexico. There is a tariff war that is going on as we speak, including most recently 200% tariffs on French wine. And we learned that it is actually okay now for the US government to bribe officials of other countries in order to do business. Domestically, the Gulf of Mexico, which of blessed memory is now the Gulf of America. Trump has vowed to eliminate the Department of Education, curiously. There has been an attack on transgender identity, which I'm sure you know about. He's removed all vestiges of diversity, equity, and inclusion from all areas of government. He's appointed Elon Musk and his crew of 20-somethings at Doge, who have been directed to dispose of civil servants and programs. I don't know if you read today's newspaper, but Elon Musk has explained that Stalin, Mao, and Hitler didn't murder millions of people. The public sector employees did, apparently. The Trump administration has revoked environmental protection laws. It seems that greenhouse gases are now no longer a threat. Nice to know. He has recently invoked the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to detain and deport people by simply declaring that the country has been invaded. And you probably know that some people are a bit upset with Tesla, and there have been some acts of vandalism against Tesla vehicles and installations. Trump has now declared that violence against Tesla will be considered a domestic terrorism event. Internationally, Trump has explained that he will get Gaza from Israel, remove 2 million Palestinians, and redevelop Gaza into the Riviera on the Mediterranean. I'm sure you've all enjoyed the video. He's explained that the US will get Greenland one way or another, and they will seize control of the Panama Canal. Trump, through one of his executive orders, has imposed sanctions against the International Criminal Court for issuing an arrest warrant against Israeli President Netanyahu. And this is from the executive order. This is part of the explanation. Neither the USA nor Israel has ever recognized the ICC's jurisdiction, and both nations are thriving democracies with militaries that strictly adhere to the laws of war. Who knew? And of course, there's the funding freeze of USAID, where Elon Musk has explained that USAID is a criminal organization and it is time for it to die, says he. And of course, the USAID cuts have had the ripple effect of putting lives at risk around the world. And of course, that includes cuts to programs that Rotary has been sponsoring or co-sponsoring around the world. You will know that just a couple of weeks ago, the United States voted along with Russia, North Korea, and Belarus against a United Nations motion condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he has called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator and has blamed the Ukraine for starting the war. All of which is to say that there seems to be some rationale for the accusation made against Trump 2.0 of showing contempt for international law, for the rules-based order of international trade, and for the rule of law generally. A few things just to think about while, if you still have the appetite to have your lunch. So please enjoy your food. Talk about what you want to ask Brendon, and I'll introduce Brendon after we eat. All right, so continue to enjoy. Thanks. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's time. I've had a brief chat with Brendon, and I'm fascinated by the 3 minutes we've just spoken about the history of USAID. You'll find out more in a moment. Brendon O'Connor is a professor of US politics and US foreign relations. He's on the faculty of the University of Sydney in the United States Studies Center. He's also a member of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's the editor of 7 books on anti-Americanism and has also published articles on books on American welfare policy, presidential politics, US foreign policy, and Australian-American relations. So he is exactly the kind of person who can bring some expertise and perspective to the world of Trump 2.0. And as I mentioned, he's prepared a talk that focuses or deals with humanitarian aid and peace, but he's very happy to talk about the broader issues that I know you've always been thinking about. Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Brendon O'Connor?
I mean, this is a hard topic to talk about. Thank you for that introduction, because all of you are probably experts on Trump. It's kind of hard not to be. During the first Trump administration, my mother would say to me, you know, she was sick of waking up in the morning and the first story being, what did Trump say overnight? You know, what was the statement? So I'm sure you're following all of this very closely. I will go through a few of the events, but I won't belabor those. I want to talk about a couple of books that I'm writing, which Trump is a kind of sort of central character. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we make sense of Trump, how our labels like fascism or conservatism or authoritarianism, are they useful? Do they kind of give us some picture that Trump isn't really unique, as much as there's, I think, this tendency in the media to say, look, we've never seen anything like this guy before. He's this combination of a kind of circus showman, a huckster, and a kind of, you know, mini authoritarian tending towards some fascism, that he's, you know, unknown in human history, anyone like him. I mean, Berlusconi definitely had aspects of Trump. There's American politicians from the past. Those of you who spent a bit of time maybe in your life in Queensland might recognize elements of Joe Bjelke-Peterson in Trump. So there are parallels. And I think I'll talk a little bit about history in my talk. And then I want to end up with just some short comments at the end about how Australia as a government might deal with the Trump administration and what seems to be the kind of current approach and what might be an alternative to that. Because I was invited to talk about peace and development, I will start off talking a little bit about USAID, because that, I think, has been the most dramatic element in the early Trump administration. And I mean, short term, that will be the most consequential. That will have really serious consequences. We have the latest reports are that 83% of all US aid and development grants have been cancelled. Most of the workforce of USAID is either on sort of leave or being dismissed. There's reports that around the world, there's about, I have some figures down here that I should consult, about 60,000 workers around the world that have been laid off. The consequences of cutting these aid and development programs, you know, I don't take this from me, but I've been sort of correlating statistics from people who've worked for the agency. One of these individuals, assistant sort of secretary in the agency or assistant to the head of the agency, was interviewed a couple of days ago by the New Yorker, by David Remnick, and claimed that the effects of cutting the humanitarian assistance, the health programs, the famine relief programs will be, over the next few years, deaths into the hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or more. And now, so this, you know, this should be, of course, taken, I think, as a tragedy, that this is some work that the United States has been doing, somewhat unheralded work. I mean, this is the kind of good things that lots of governments do that people aren't particularly aware of. the governments, for a variety of reasons, sometimes don't want to over sort of promote, because there's always a sector of the population that will think, why isn't this money being spent at home? Why are we spending money saving Ethiopians or South Africans or people in Nepal? Your organization is obviously a group of people who don't think like that in the main, the good work that you do, but there is always that constituency. What is interesting about the kind of cuts to US aid, development programs, is that popular support for those programs in recent years, I looked at the sort of, the Pew surveys are generally the best things to look at on this kind of question, has actually been increasing. The percentage of Americans who oppose these programs probably hit a height in about 2013. That's a kind of interesting date. About 48% of the population in surveys are opposed to money being spent overseas on aid and development. Whereas by 2019, so just in the sort of lead up to the kind of pandemic, the COVID pandemic, only 28% of Americans were saying they oppose money being spent on aid. So the sort of the saying, well, it's driven by popular opinion, I think is hard to make. Over the last few weeks, surveys that have come out have shown about 25% of Americans opposing money being spent on foreign aid. Maybe there's been decent media reporting about how some of this aid goes to famine. Famine relief at the moment in Ethiopia is really desperately needed. Anyone who's been following the level of civil war, destruction in Ethiopia, doesn't get a lot of media time, will know there's an absolute humanitarian crisis there. Famine relief in Ethiopia arrives with the American flag on wheat and grain products, on rice. So it's a great way of promoting this idea of soft power, this idea that America is doing good things in the world without necessarily strings attached. Now, to say all aid doesn't have strings attached, I think would be going a little too far. About 27% of USAID spending before this year was on economic development. A lot of that would be tied into American companies. So a lot of the money that's spent has a purpose to create opportunities for Americans. It's not just, I mean, I think if you saw the work USAID does is completely benign, entirely altruistic, with no aim to get sort of Americans to get economic benefits from it. I think that would be a tad naive. But the humanitarian side of it, which is about 21% of what was spent, that is much more in the areas of famine relief, disaster relief, hurricane relief, drought relief, and some of the, and then about 22% for health programs. Now, that is where America has made a really big difference. The humanitarian spending, the health program spending is about 40% of all world spending in these programs. And that's where the cuts will frankly lead to people dying. That will lead to people being very sick. And the short-sightedness of this is obviously if there's tuberculosis programs, if there's increase in measles, if the world sort of HIV/AIDS crisis increases, as we saw with COVID, you can't lock off your borders. And so there's a kind of, there's a enlightened self-interest to some of the disease prevention as well, that it eventually comes to you. Some of you may be, like me, shaking your head at the Secretary for Health and his choices about vaccinations, his commentary about measles recently, his attitude towards kind of preventative health and the use of vaccinations. So I suppose this is all part of a bigger parcel, a kind of changing attitude towards expertise, a changing attitude towards, scientific knowledge in many regards, and also thinking about the long term. A lot of this is, this is going to make us happy or some kind of impact or speak to a constituency tomorrow. It's going to dominate the headlines for the next month. But what happens in a year's time, we don't have to worry so much about that. There's a lot of exaggeration in terms of how much money America spends on international aid and development. It really hovers around about 1% of the federal budget over the last sort of 20, 25 years. So if you ask people in surveys, how much money is spent on foreign aid. It's usually a sense that it's, 20%. It's really significantly higher than it is, but it has hovered around 1%. And that has done a lot of good work, that particularly in the area of HIV/AIDS, the amount of lives that have been saved is really, really significant. I'm not an expert on aid programs. There's people who do development aid. My kind of angle into this is really a book I'm writing on the long history of this kind of stereotype of Americans. Some of you say the stereotype might be reinforced at the moment more so than in previous presidencies. The stereotype of the ugly American. The American that goes abroad and says, look, I don't need to learn your language. I don't even need to know your history, but I'll tell you how to run your society. I know what's best for you. I know what kind of agriculture you should build on. I know what kind of industry you should build on. You should learn my language. I shouldn't learn your language. Now, this notion has been around for a long time. And so my book has taken me a long time to finish because it's a 200-year history of this idea. But it really crystallized this idea into public debate in the 1950s. And in 1956, two authors, one of them a military retired individual and his friend, wrote this book called The Ugly American. And the book has a lot of confusing things. The Ugly American is actually the good guy, but the idea got forward that the Ugly American was this kind of arrogant individual who went to a country like Vietnam in the book and told people how to live. And that book was made into a film which stars Marlon Brando. And anyone who's a fan of sort of early Brando or its movies, I'd highly recommend it. It's a very sort of, charismatic kind of performance. And this was particularly the book was really something that President Kennedy, as a senator in the US Senate from Massachusetts, was really taken by. And he took to this idea that America had to address this, that for all of America's wealth and power and influence, there was undoubtedly this edge of arrogance and a degree of lack of interest in learning other countries' languages, lack of interest in other cultures. So he said he wanted to do something about this. And he gave a copy of this book to all of his Senate colleagues and was proselytizing for this book and the idea. And when he was elected in 1960, he set about setting up two organizations, USAID, to sort of spread a kind of different version of American aid and development around the world and being pushed through the State Department and things like the Marshall Plan. And he set up the US Peace Corps. And the US Peace Corps had the idea, and it still exists, how much longer will be an interesting question, but it sent out young Americans, volunteers. They didn't get paid a wage. They just got a stipend, a living allowance. It sent out Americans around the world to help with building wells, helping on farms, helping people on minor sort of development projects, and to just be there to listen and learn and not come along as the experts, not as the engineers, but more straight out of high school or just after your undergraduate degree. And at its height in 1966, the US Peace Corps, and I had a very good colleague who was an American colleague, enthusiastic sort of NPR listener who'd always be ringing me up saying, have you heard about what Bush has done? And so I miss Dennis, and I imagine this wouldn't be a happy time for him. He was one of these Peace Corps in around 1966 when 15,000 Americans were sent around the world to 52 countries to kind of listen, to help out, to kind of learn. Eventually, about 142 countries received assistance. Currently, the program has shrunk quite considerably. Currently, there is about 900 volunteers around the world. So from that 15,000, it may not survive the Trump administration, the US Peace Corps program, but it is part of, I suppose, trying to present to the world a different picture of America and trying for Americans to go abroad and learn. And that America, which wants to promote its kind of soft power, its influence, its want for other nations to be kind of co-opted rather than sort of coerced, that America is dying. And I think many people in our government particularly have the kind of notion that it will be a bit like the first Trump administration, this administration, There'll be a lot of sort of big statements, big claims, but the alliance with Australia can survive. A hopeful vision of America can survive. I think it's a little different this time around. Trump has surrounded himself with people who he will delegate to, let do a lot of things like Elon Musk is doing. A lot of people who are more aligned, I think, to his very negative view of, say, international development or cooperation with other nations, the United Nations, World Health Organization, obviously the United States pulled out of. So I think it's going to be much deeper, long-lasting, the effects. And there's a whole sort of version of Trump's ahead of us. People like J.D. Vance. The Republican Party is much more molded in the image of Donald Trump in a way it wasn't in 2016, 2017. So the notion that this is just an aberration from my reading of American politics is wrong. I think quite sort of foolish in many regards, just wishful thinking. And I was making arguments like this around 2010, 2011, that the Republican Party is profoundly changing. And if you were looking at local elections in America, you're looking at lower levels of the US Congress. What happened in 2016 is not as surprising as I think some people tended to think it was. There were a lot of signs, and a lot of people who were just rejecting basic science on global warming, who were quite happy for the US to default on its foreign debts, who were quite happy to think the rule of law was something that you follow if you agree with it. There was a mood of kind of election sort of denialism in the lead up to the 2016 election. If you listen closely, there were a lot of claims by Trump in that election that if he lost, it would be because he was frauded out of it. It was because the election would have been stolen by Hillary Clinton. So it depends on what you were listening to. And there's probably more hope in me than some of you in this room that there will be an America that is quite different to this in the future. But I think if you listen very broadly and you see where the Republican Party is at, a lot of this isn't as surprising as I think some of our media presents it, and it probably is going to be a lot more long-lasting. I want to say a few things about a couple of other policy issues, say a little bit about the environment, a little bit about Ukraine and Gaza, and then I will kind of give some analysis of like, how do we make sense of this? So I just want to get a kind of idea. I want to get your questions. How much longer should I talk for? Just should have had I don't have a clock in front of me, or I all right, okay, about another 15 minutes. Okay, so I won't rehash the kind of policy sort of developments for too long. I think the decisions that Trump has made on pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, taking down the words global warming from a number of websites, the general sort of dismissal of climate change as a problem will be the most long-term consequential problem of the Trump administration. It's not getting as much attention to begin with, but that is, I think, going to set the world back in the most dramatic way. I think that is, for me, the most kind of consequential thing about Trump being elected over Harris, is their very different positions they had on whether global warming is a serious problem to be addressed immediately or something to not be particularly worried about. On Ukraine, obviously the meeting in the White House was really unbecoming. I mean, one of the most kind of, dramatic kind of performative events in modern American history in that Oval Office, the treatment of Zelensky, no matter what your views on the topic are, for that to be global diplomacy was remarkable. Usually when a diplomat or a foreign leader comes to the White House press corps get about 2 or 3 minutes to take some photos, maybe call out a question, usually ignored, then the doors are closed and the real business takes place. At this event, there were 45 minutes of press questioning as the doors were kept open. Now, some people might call that sort of a new age of transparent democracy, but a lot of it was very performative. It was clearly to a group of supporters of Trump's that are very negative on funding to Ukraine. I think it's hard not to say fairly pro-Putin So that, whatever the aim of that was, I don't think that was the right way to conduct diplomacy. The Ukrainian issue, I have a lot of debates with my colleagues on this issue. A lot of my colleagues who study this closely, a lot of international experts, academics in this area, put serious blame on the United States for the invasion of Ukraine, arguing that the movement of NATO through the Baltic states right up to the Russian borders after the fall of the Soviet Union was a very bad decision from the United States. I go backwards and forwards on that one. I've got sort of mixed views on that as the sort of precipitating event. I think on the other hand, you have to look at the brutality of the Putin regime, Putin's own treatment of his own people, his anti-democratic tendencies, his brutality and killing of rivals. So I think putting all of the blame on US policies during the Clinton and George H.W. Bush and even the George Bush era, I think sort of absolves Putin to an extent that I wouldn't be willing to make. I think one of the remarkable factors of the Ukrainian conflict is the level of deaths and injuries of Russian troops. This really doesn't get, I think, as enough play as it should. Some estimates have it about 180,000 Russian troops have died. That's almost 3 times the number of Americans who died in the 10 years in Vietnam. So that some claims also 700,000 Russian casualties. Obviously, a huge number of Ukrainian casualties. Not the level of deaths on the Ukrainian side is considerably less than on the Russian side. So the brutality that Putin is committing all the time to his own people is really significant. Obviously, Russia starts this war. Any sort of understanding that doesn't accept that as basic facts is remarkable. On Gaza, this has become a very difficult topic to talk about at universities and our public in general. This is something that has led to myself having an article about just recommending some readings to my students on this topic, an article in one of the newspapers in Sydney. So people, I think, are sort of pulling back. Many of my colleagues won't talk about this issue. And I think that's a tragedy. It needs to be talked about. It's fantastic that the Rotary organization is trying to do things in both Israel and the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. What has occurred in Gaza, I think if we follow it closely, is a humanitarian crisis. The level of destruction of the Gaza Strip, if you just spend a few hours on YouTube looking at sort of videos of the Gaza Strip today, I think you get a very good sense of what went on in the bombing campaign in that area. What I suppose has been remarkable to follow from the Trump administration is the sort of brazenness of this kind of claim about, turning the Gaza Strip into US territory and a holiday resort. I mean, one of the things with Trump, and this gets us back to our kind of fascism point, is the line between nonsense, humor, and macabre reality is quite hard to decipher often. And that has often been the way with dictators and fascists. Mussolini, much of the commentary on early Mussolini is very much, this guy's a joke. This guy, we can't take this guy seriously. He's a bit of a performative kind of clown. And then more and more power is accrued and more people who have dismissed him have to start to sort of question themselves on, well, what was wrong with me? Why didn't I see this? Why did I not take this seriously? And I think there's a lot of that with Trump on, okay, these photos with Benjamin Netanyahu on beach chairs, is this just punking people? Is this just trying to rile people up? Is this just to be dismissed and not to be taken seriously? Or is this something which is really entertained? Now, on the Gaza issue, I think the steps to achieve it would be so kind of improbable that it sort of is still, for me, at that end of the spectrum of kind of performative, in some ways, riling up the opposition. But then on many other issues, I felt like that occasionally as well, that there's a progression to it being more of a reality. I've been following, as I think a lot of people who work at universities very closely, the arrest of Columbia University student over the last few days, or last week or so. Mahmoud Khalil, leader of the protests, one of the leaders of the protests on the Columbia University campus. He was taken out of his house in New York. Originally, it was claimed he was sent to a detention center in New Jersey. It seems that he's more likely to be in a detention center in Louisiana at the moment. He is a green card holder, so that makes him a permanent resident of the United States. His wife was a citizen of the United States. The explanation for this arrest by the immigration authorities in the United States is being that he is takes a pro-Hamas position. There's been denial of this by himself, by those who are associated with him. There hasn't seemingly come forward any hard evidence of this in terms of pamphlets or speeches, given the amount of coverage of this issue. I think that's quite sort of remarkable. I think for many people, this is a really big test case for the sort of tipping point between threats of authoritarianism and really questioning America is moving into the area of being a police state, that the rule of law is very much on the line in this case. I mean, thinking about this case over the last sort of week or so, one of the things that comes to mind in terms of attitudes to Hamas are the very long reports that the New York Times did in late 2003, early 2004, showing the associations between the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu particularly, and Qatar, and Qatar's funding of Hamas. The amount of money now estimated into the billions of dollars that went from Qatar to Hamas over the last couple of decades or so, or last decade, that was authorized from all of the major reporting, investigative reporting by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quite aware of this, supportive of this. So those who would say, well, anyone who has aided and abetted Hamas or has had any kind of associations with Hamas is an enemy of the United States, might want to think, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of details to get across on this issue. Okay, how do we sum all this up? One simple way to do this is to say, well, this is really very personality driven. That Trump is a kind of narcissist or an egoist. He's erratic. This is kind of, as one scholar, Daniel Dresner puts it, this is a kind of toddler in chief. This is a sort of daily or weekly attention seeking kind of thing. And that's how a lot of the newspaper reporting on Trump goes, a lot of reporting like this in Australia. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I tend to avoid that to some extent. I don't think it gets us that far. And I actually think there are real faults to thinking this guy has no ideology, has no set of beliefs. The people around him don't really have much of a master plan. It's all just haphazard and random. During the 2024 campaign, the Heritage Foundation put out a massive report called Project 2025, and a lot of things in that report are being put in place during the Trump administration. So there is a manifesto, and that was something that was done in 1981, and that was very influential on the Reagan administration, and this is in some ways the blueprint for what is going on. The other kind of obvious explanation is to say, well, this is all kind of local politics, that US foreign policy is really being driven, maybe more so than in any time I can think of, by the people who voted for Trump. That this is about repaying and kind of rewarding the constituency most enthusiastic about Trump on Twitter or X, and their concerns about immigration, about sort of multiculturalism, kind of a lot of the sort of anti-feminist stuff. One of the first things the United States did when Trump was elected is get rid of funding that might go to birth control through the UN or abortion programs. So there are these kind of moves that are made generally by each Republican administration. I think that gets us to a certain degree, that a lot of the stuff to do with Europe, Musk and Vance's kind of criticism of the EU and saying that the AfD must get more of a place in kind of conferences and German politics, that I think is driven by a kind of deep dislike of certain kind of forces in American life, the sort of racial composition of American society, multicultural ideas, obviously diversity programs. Musk has really gone sort of way out sort of to the far right on a lot of these things. I mean, giving actual kind of conference level support in an election to the sort of neo-Nazi party in Germany, the AfD, is a remarkable kind of event. You can see why the current German likely chancellor, who's a member of the Conservatives in Germany, is incensed by this. I think for the Germans, that was just, you know, an absolute kind of turning point that not only Musk, but the vice president would give some fuel to this party. I think that sort of breaks, you know, the kind of long-standing Atlantic relationship with Germany. And Germany is, I think, quite different place to, say, France and Britain, who want to, in some ways, keep the house together of NATO and keep the alliances across the Atlantic in some kind of tact. I think the Germans are just trying to work out how they kind of move further and further away from this administration, which I think is a very interesting kind of politics to follow. How we might kind of summarize all of this, I've sort of talked for about 2 or 3 minutes on kind of what might be kinds of ways of thinking about this. I could say a lot more about sort of mercantilism, about tariffs, but I'll try to talk at a kind of broad level for the next 2 or 3 minutes and then plenty of time for questions. There seem to me kind of 3 interesting ways to look at what's going on at a kind of analytical or an academic level, the kind of level that I might want to write about in various books, and might send some of you to sleep, but kind of bear with me. The first level would be to say, this is actually not as new as we think, and there's actually a lot in common going on if you've been paying really close attention and you'd been living in the places most affected by US foreign policy with the Reagan administration and with the George W. Bush administration. And in terms of Trump's kind of tendencies to use military intervention, I would make, I think, very obvious point that what Trump has done so far in his 4 years of president and in the short second term is nowhere near as destructive as George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003, both for US standing in the world. I think that has a dramatic cascading effect in terms of the rivalry with China, but just the sheer numbers of people who die in that war in Iraq is, you know, there's nothing comparable to that in the first Trump administration in terms of military intervention. And even if you compare it with the Reagan administration of the 1980s, the amount of military support that the Reagan administration gives in El Salvador and Honduras, and the amount of deaths that can be probably fairly attributed to those military aid and the support of the Contras and various militia groups in El Salvador, that is incredibly destructive. And it's one of the reasons for the current immigration crisis in the United States, that politics leads to literally the percentage of people who die in the Nicaraguan wars of the 1980s is more than all the Americans who die in wars as a percentage of population up to the Vietnam War in a kind of 8-year period. So incredibly destructive in terms of the number. Now, very few people know much about El Salvador or Honduras and its history, and so it didn't really get much press, and, you know, people forget it as a kind of footnote in the Cold War. But incredibly destructive policies that there's nothing comparable to that in the first Trump administration. Now, that's not to say there won't be things just as bad as that, but I think it's useful to have some kind of context to say, okay, it's easy to say this is the worst that's ever been and this is the worst things that have ever happened. My view would be no, from the historical record. So I'm very worried about USAID. I'm very worried about environmental long-term impacts. But in terms of military intervention, I think Trump is kind of to fully understand Trump on this front, I think is quite complicated. And I don't think there's actually much want to put troops on the ground in any kind of conflict. And there certainly wasn't in the first administration. The second way of seeing Trump is to say, okay, this guy admires strongmen, he admires Putin, he admires Orban, particularly I think the playbook from Hungary. If you really want to get into this and deeply study it, you probably got to spend quite a bit of time studying Viktor Orban and him as a role model in some ways for Trump and Vance and, you know, people like Tucker Carlson and the wider circle. Orban has, I think, been really has got a playbook for how to be a sort of Democrat, but also an authoritarian, how to be both kind of for elections if they work out in the way you want them, but against other forms of the rule of law. And so that, I think, is one of the obvious ways of thinking about Trump, that Trump has no problem being an authoritarian. Authoritarians tend to be sort of anti-democratic, leader-led systems, lack of an ideology, and short on kind of bigger picture. The last thing that I want to mention is to say, okay, should we see Trump as a fascist? Is this kind of bordering into fascism? And David and I have had somewhat of an exchange on this. And I suppose I think that recent actions, more than the first term, lead us in that direction. They lead us in the direction because fascism at its core is a kind of nationalistic has an ultra-nationalism that sort of draws on race hatred. It has a tendency to see the state as having kind of extrajudicial powers, the executive, and say the American case. It sees the rule of law as something that can be discarded. That's very much, I think, in the realms of what's going on at the moment. And it draws on violence. It sees violence positively. That violence in some ways can inspire, and that violence can lead to a kind of joy and ecstasy that allows for supporters to feel some degree of kind of release or vindication. And it isn't just state violence, it's the violence of the mob. Now, some might say, well, that's already going on Twitter or X with doxing and with following people. But I think that, for me, that's the tipping point. And we're very much on the borderline of that tipping point. Now, it can get a hell of a lot worse. And I think it will over the next year. So I think my want has been not to start with a volume at 10 out of 10 and say this is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. It isn't. To start it at 7 or 8 and know when to turn it up. And I think that's one of the challenges with dealing with Trump, that personally I find him in a kind of an abhorrent character. His attitude to women, his kind of everyday racism. There's many ways to dislike this man, but not everything he's doing and not on every day is it, I think, the most useful tactic to say this is the worst politician we have seen in the history of humanity, or even the worst American president on every issue. There are many things which I think USAID, which he is, in the environment, given what we know, but the sense of where do we focus our kind of attention and criticism, I think for me has been a really important question. Thanks for your patience. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
We've got time maybe for just a couple of questions. Okay, let me hear first, please. Give me the quick question, please.
I promise I'll be quick. I actually have 2 questions, but just one. Okay. Then the second one. That's harder to answer. Hi, it's Neil, by the way. Pleasure to listen to you. I'm an international security student at the University of Sydney. And this keeps on going on in my head when I think about this time of Trump's second time in the office, how long this can last, do you reckon? Because so many people are turning their backs on him who were supporting him all along. And of course, there are protests going on in the US right now, big ones. Do you really think he will be spending this whole time in the office like no direction, or something will happen.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but he's not likely to resign. It's very unlikely that he'll be impeached. That was tried before. So I think if he has good health and there's no extraordinary event, he's very, very likely to be president for the next 4 years. I think that's something people have got to get used to. A publisher in Australia rang me up 1 year into the first Trump term and said, "Oh, we want you to do this book on Trump in Australia." And I said, "Oh yeah, well, I'll think about it." And then they got back to me a week later and said, "Look, all of our editors have had a meeting and we think it's really obvious that Trump will only last 1 year. So this book would be a waste of time. And, you know, everyone knows he's going to be impeached or pushed out." And I'm thinking, well, it's not like the Australian system. You can't just sort of have a vote amongst the cabinet and get, or the caucus and get rid of someone. US presidents tend to stick around. They don't tend to resign. Nixon is the exception to the rule, and there are a lot of hands on a lot of issues, and Trump wouldn't probably move in the way Nixon did. So get used to it. He'll be here for 4 years. It's very, very likely, given that he's in good health or there's no kind of assassination or anything like that, he's going to be president. He's not going to be pushed out by the Republican Party. To impeach someone in the Senate, you need two-thirds of the Senate, 67 votes. That's not probably going to occur. So this is our next 4 years. This guy is going to be running the show in US politics. He may be hobbled if the share market, I think, has dramatic collapse, if the Democrats win the midterms by a sizable majority. But yeah, his voice is going to be with us for the next 4 years, and his policies.
I think it's once been said, things are going to get worse, it's going to get worse. Question. Very hard question. I think we have a question from past President Charlie Allen on the Zoom. And the question is this China's big chance to shine, replace the aid void?
Yeah, on many fronts. You know, that I think the preference in the 2016 election, clearly from the Russians and the Chinese, was for Trump to be elected. I think it's a little more complicated. I mean, with the Chinese in the 2024 election. But I think this opportunity for China to step in on the aid front, on the development programs particularly, and strings attached to those with the Belt and Road program, so you can see those maybe expanding as well.